The quiet hum of the suburban evening was always the same in Maple Crest Estates. Neatly trimmed lawns, identical beige houses, and an unspoken rule that everyone followed the HOA's commands without question. I never had a problem with it, not really. I kept my yard pristine, my hedges manicured. I paid my dues on time, never attended meetings, and lived under the radar. That was my first mistake. Because when you go unnoticed, people assume you don't matter. That's exactly what Randy Colton thought when he had my sprinkler system shut off. The notice on my door was written in that same condescending, bureaucratic tone the HOA always used: violation of community water usage policy, immediate suspension of privileges. No warning, no hearing, just an arbitrary decision from a man who had no idea who he was messing with. Because here's the thing about Maple Crest Estates. Beneath its polished, picture-perfect surface, the entire community's water infrastructure ran on a system that I secretly controlled. The same system that Randy and his cronies just declared war on, and they had no idea. The letter felt heavier than it should have, its crisp edges digging into my fingers as I read the words again, slowly, deliberately, letting them sink in. Immediate suspension of privileges. The phrase carried the cold efficiency of a corporate memo, a decision made in some distant boardroom by people who never had to deal with the consequences of their rulings. My water had been cut, at least the parts of it they could control. The sprinkler system, the irrigation lines, the external access points. They hadn't touched the house supply yet, probably knowing that would be legally dubious, but it was clear this wasn't about water conservation or community welfare. This was about power, about control, about Randy Colton flexing his authority in the most passive-aggressive way possible. I already knew why they had chosen me. For weeks, I had heard whispers of the HOA tightening its grip, cracking down on so-called excessive water usage. Maggie Fenton, the treasurer, had been complaining in meetings about the community budget, emphasizing the rising costs of maintenance, conveniently overlooking the fact that homes like Randy's, those of the board members and their close allies, remained lush and green while others were subjected to arbitrary restrictions. The HOA had turned enforcement into a game, picking and choosing their targets, issuing warnings and fines without explanation, waiting to see who would comply without question. And I, quiet and unobtrusive, had seemed like the perfect target. They saw me as a rule follower, a resident who never caused trouble, someone easy to push around. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to ask, was that for the last several years, I had been the one quietly keeping their entire water system running. It had started when the previous infrastructure manager abruptly quit, leaving the HOA scrambling for a replacement. Rather than hiring someone competent, they had outsourced the job to a third-party firm that only handled remote monitoring, never actual repairs or maintenance. Issues piled up, small problems became bigger ones, and the system teetered on the edge of collapse. Seeing the inevitable disaster ahead, I had stepped in, using my background in systems engineering to stabilize things. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. It wasn't official. It wasn't something the HOA had asked me to do. But I had kept things running, patching leaks, optimizing flow rates, ensuring that the community's water infrastructure didn't crumble under their negligence. And now, without realizing it, they had picked a fight with the one person who could bring it all to a grinding halt. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the notice, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. I could have stormed into Randy's office, demanded an explanation, forced a confrontation. But that wasn't my style. No, if they wanted to play a game of control, I would let them believe they had won, for now. I would let them think they had shut me down, that I was just another homeowner bowing to their authority. I would let them enjoy their moment of victory, blissfully unaware that the very system they took for granted, the one they relied on without question, was already in my hands. They had moved their first piece. It was only fair that I responded in kind. I didn't react right away. I let the notice sit on my kitchen counter, its presence a quiet reminder of the line the HOA had just crossed, while I went about my usual routine, pretending, at least outwardly, that nothing had changed. I kept my interactions with neighbors brief, nodding politely at the usual early morning dog walkers and retirees tending to their flower beds, listening for any signs that word had spread about the latest round of HOA enforced restrictions. For the most part, it hadn't. People had grown so used to the board's overreach that few even questioned these sudden, arbitrary punishments anymore. But that would change soon. By midweek, I started noticing subtle shifts. My front lawn, which had always been one of the healthiest in the neighborhood, began to show the first signs of stress, browning at the edges, the blades of grass curling slightly in the heat. It wasn't dramatic yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone on the HOA's watch list took note. Sure enough, on Thursday afternoon, as I returned from running errands, I spotted Derek Hensley, the HOA vice president, standing near the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes. He didn't acknowledge me at first, but I could see the self-satisfied smirk he was trying to suppress. I didn't give him the reaction he wanted. I simply walked past him, offering nothing more than a polite, measured nod, as if I hadn't already decided that his entire organization was about to experience a reckoning. I spent that evening checking the community's water management logs. The HOA's third-party firm had an automated system that controlled irrigation access points, but they were lazy. They relied on preset schedules, assumed the infrastructure was solid, and, most importantly, didn't realize that someone had been making quiet optimizations behind the scenes for years. That someone, of course, was me. Every adjustment they thought was just the system fixing itself had actually been my handiwork. Every minor reroute, every manual override, every late-night fix to prevent a pressure drop in the far end of the neighborhood, it had all been me. And now they had cut off my access. I took my time, reviewing every connection point, watching the system run its usual cycles, noting the weaknesses I had patched over the years. Without me, those cracks would resurface. Without me, their delicate balance would start to unravel. The first sign came Friday morning. I was out front, trimming my hedges, when I heard Tony Alvarez, my next-door neighbor, cursing under his breath. He was standing on his lawn, staring down at his flower beds, where the soil had turned bone dry overnight. The automatic irrigation should have kicked in hours ago. It hadn't. I waited a few moments before strolling over, feigning casual curiosity. "Something wrong?" Tony sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I think my sprinklers are busted. They were fine yesterday, but this morning, nothing." I bent down, brushing my fingers against the parched dirt, masking the satisfaction I felt. "Could be a pressure issue," I offered, watching his expression shift as he considered it. "Might not just be you. You checked with the HOA?" His face darkened at the mention of them. "Not yet. You know how they are. Probably just tell me I need to review the community policies or some other nonsense." He shook his head, muttering something about how they always had a reason to fine people but never actually helped when there was a real problem. I nodded, offering him a small, understanding smile. "Yeah. Let me know if you hear anything." That night, I made my next move. I disengaged one of the hidden pressure regulators, the one that compensated for fluctuations in demand across the entire community. Normally, this device ensured that all homes received even water distribution, preventing overuse in one area from affecting another. Without it, the system would struggle to maintain balance. Some homes would experience shortages, others would get flooded. And because the HOA had no idea how their own infrastructure actually worked, they wouldn't know how to fix it. I sat back, watching the logs update in real time, monitoring the subtle shifts as the first tremors of instability took hold. I could already picture the chaos unfolding, the rising complaints, the board scrambling for answers, the very people who had thought they controlled everything now completely at my mercy. They had taken something from me. Now it was my turn. By Saturday morning, the cracks in the system were no longer subtle. Complaints started rolling in, first a few, then a flood. Some homeowners woke up to find their irrigation systems had stopped entirely, leaving flower beds and vegetable gardens parched beneath the rising spring sun. Others stepped outside to see water pooling in their yards, sprinklers gushing uncontrollably, flooding sidewalks and driveways. The HOA's prized uniformity, its perfect manicured lawns and controlled aesthetic, was unraveling right before their eyes. I sipped my coffee on the front porch, watching as Margaret Fenton marched down the street in her usual fast-paced waddle, clipboard clutched in one hand, phone pressed to her ear with the other. Even from a distance, I could hear the agitation in her voice. She wasn't just frustrated, she was panicked. I knew why. This wasn't just a random malfunction. The HOA's remote monitoring system, the one they had so arrogantly relied on, couldn't fix what was happening. Their system had been programmed to assume stability, to make automatic adjustments under the assumption that everything was in working order. But I had introduced chaos, and chaos wasn't something their software knew how to handle. I kept my expression neutral as Derek Hensley, the ever-dutiful vice president, pulled up in his spotless SUV, stepping out with an air of manufactured authority. He and Margaret exchanged hurried words, their tones sharp, urgent. I caught snippets as they passed. Water pressures fluctuating all over the place. We might have a main line issue. Residents are calling non-stop. Then, the inevitable. Margaret turned toward me. Ethan. Her voice was strained, her usual faux-friendly tone fraying at the edges. Have you been having issues with your irrigation? I let a puzzled frown cross my face, tilting my head slightly. Yeah, actually. My sprinklers stopped working a few days ago. I thought it was just me. I gestured toward Tony Alvarez's yard, where he stood in his driveway, glaring down at the dry earth. Looks like Tony's got the same problem, and I heard from Stephanie Caldwell that her backyard flooded overnight. Margaret's eyes darted between me and Derek, their faces shifting as they realized that this wasn't just a localized issue. It was widespread, and it was getting worse. Derek exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. We need to get the water contractor out here, he muttered. Margaret nodded, already tapping furiously at her phone. I'll call the company now. We need someone on site immediately. And there it was, the moment I had been waiting for. The moment they would try to fix it. The moment they would discover the truth. Because the company they had been outsourcing to for years, the one they assumed was still handling their water system, had actually ended their contract months ago. I knew, because I had been the one quietly keeping things running in their absence, maintaining the system while the HOA, in their arrogance, had continued operating as if nothing had changed. They had never bothered to check, never questioned whether someone was still actively overseeing the infrastructure. They had just assumed because that was what people like Randy, Margaret, and Derek did. And now, when they finally reached out, they would get the answer they never expected. There was no one left to call. I took another slow sip of coffee, letting the realization settle in as Margaret's expression shifted from frustration to confusion, and then, slowly, to horror. The wheels were coming off. The perfect community they had micromanaged into submission was starting to crack. And the best part, they still didn't know I was behind it. Not yet. But they would. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing with unease. The Maple Crest Estates community Facebook group, normally a place for passive-aggressive complaints about trash cans left out too long or fences painted the wrong shade of beige, had turned into a battleground of frustration and confusion. Post after post flooded in. Why is my backyard flooded? Anyone else's sprinklers dead? HOA better fix this ASAP. I pay my dues for a reason. The longer it went unresolved, the more the tension built. And from where I sat on my porch, sipping another cup of coffee, I could tell the HOA was running out of ways to contain it. Margaret Fenton had made 3 calls already, each one growing louder and more desperate as she paced back and forth near the community center. Derek Hensley stood nearby, arms crossed, pretending to be in control while visibly sweating. And Randy Colton, the great dictator of Maple Crest Estates, had finally arrived on scene, looking every bit the part of an executive stepping in to fix a problem. His pressed polo and carefully combed hair might have fooled some of the more gullible homeowners, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle clench of his fingers as he realized the scale of what they were dealing with. I kept my expression neutral as Tony Alvarez walked up beside me, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold. He let out a low chuckle. Think they finally realized they're screwed? I smirked but kept my gaze on the unfolding drama. Not yet, but they're getting there. Margaret, now red-faced and exasperated, lowered her phone and turned to Randy. The contractor isn't picking up, she said, voice sharp with barely contained panic. "I tried their emergency line, but it just goes to voicemail." Randy exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "Keep trying. We need someone out here before this gets worse." Margaret shook her head. "Randy, I don't think you understand. The company isn't just ignoring us. They're gone. They terminated the contract months ago." Silence. A long, heavy pause as the full weight of her words settled over the small group of board members. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Randy's nostrils flared. But Margaret was looking at me. It took them longer than I expected, but she was the first to put the pieces together. I let the moment stretch, pretending I hadn't noticed her staring. Finally, I glanced up, feigning mild curiosity. "Something wrong?" Margaret hesitated, then took a slow step forward. "Ethan, you're an engineer, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "That's right." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And you've been in the neighborhood for how long?" I set my coffee cup down deliberately. "Going on 10 years. She nodded slowly, exchanging a quick glance with Randy, who had now fixed his gaze on me as well. "And you wouldn't happen to know anything about how the water system works, would you?" I allowed a small smile to form, just enough for her to see it, but not enough to confirm anything. "Oh, I know exactly how it works." I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my words settle. "The real question is, do you?" Margaret's face paled. Randy's eyes narrowed. Derek, the clueless follower, looked like he was just now realizing they might have made a serious mistake. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't in control. I was. The weight of my words settled over them like an invisible force, heavy and suffocating, stripping away the last remnants of their assumed authority. I could see it in their shifting expressions, the slow, creeping realization that they had no contingency plan for this, no script to follow when someone they had dismissed as insignificant suddenly held all the power. Margaret, for all her rigid adherence to procedure, was the first to grasp the depth of the mistake they had made, the first to truly comprehend that their neatly structured world, the one they controlled with fines and threats and bureaucratic nonsense, was now teetering on the edge of chaos. Randy, on the other hand, was still grasping at the illusion that he could fix this with sheer force of will, still clinging to the belief that, no matter how dire the situation seemed, he could talk his way back into control. I watched him straighten his shoulders, watched as he smoothed down the front of his polo, as though adjusting his appearance could somehow shift the balance back in his favor. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured, deliberate, laced with the artificial confidence of a man who refused to acknowledge he had already lost. "All right, Ethan," he said, his tone teetering between forced authority and veiled irritation. "If you know how the system works, then maybe you can be useful. You can help us fix whatever's going on here." It was almost laughable, the way he framed it, as though I were some wayward employee who had been caught slacking off and was now being given the chance to redeem myself. I let the silence stretch, watching as his confidence faltered ever so slightly under the weight of my lack of response. Finally, I exhaled slowly, as though considering his request, before leaning forward just enough to make it clear that this was no longer a conversation on his terms. "You want me to fix this?" My voice was calm even, carrying none of the faux politeness they were so used to wielding against others. "Interesting, because just a few days ago you seemed pretty eager to cut me off entirely. That's strange, isn't it? First, you decide I don't deserve access to the water system, and now suddenly you need me to keep it from falling apart." Margaret flinched, her lips pressing together into a thin, bloodless line, and Derek had the decency to at least look uncomfortable. But Randy predictably wasn't ready to concede. "That's not the point," he said sharply, shifting his stance as though planting himself more firmly would somehow ground his authority. "The community is dealing with a crisis. People are upset. We need to get this under control before it gets worse." I let a slow, deliberate smirk form as I tilted my head slightly. "Oh, it's going to get worse." I stood then, stretching out the stiffness in my shoulders, taking my time, letting them feel the shift in momentum as I turned toward the growing murmurs from the street. The residents of Maple Crest Estates were no longer confined to grumbling on the Facebook page or complaining behind closed doors. They were out now, clusters of neighbors forming near the sidewalks, whispering, watching, waiting. Tony Alvarez had drifted closer, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression one of barely contained amusement. Even Stephanie Caldwell, a longtime supporter of the HOA, looked uneasy, her eyes darting between the board members as though seeing them clearly for the first time. The illusion of order was breaking. I turned back to Randy, my expression unreadable. "See, the problem is, I'm not sure I trust you to handle this the right way. I mean, you didn't even know your contractor was gone until 5 minutes ago. What makes you think you have the slightest idea how to fix what's coming next?" Margaret exhaled sharply, rubbing at her temple. "What do you want?" The words were forced out, stiff and reluctant, but they were the first real sign of acknowledgement that they were no longer the ones in control. I pretended to consider it, watching the way Randy bristled at the implication that I now held the power to dictate terms. "For starters," I said finally, my voice steady and measured, "I want my irrigation privileges restored. Immediately. No nonsense, no delays, no manufactured violations. You cut me off because you thought you could. Turns out, that was a mistake." I let my gaze drift between them, making sure they understood that this was just the beginning. "And then, we're going to have a real conversation about who actually runs things around here, because I don't think it's you anymore." Margaret swallowed hard, glancing toward Randy, waiting for him to fight back. But for the first time, he didn't have a response. The realization was settling in now, the unavoidable truth that the balance of power had shifted, that they had built their authority on a foundation they had never truly understood. And now that it was crumbling, there was only one person left who could hold it all together. Me. And I wasn't feeling particularly generous. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of realization. The HOA board, once so confident in their absolute authority, stood before me like a house of cards in the wind, each of them flickering between denial, frustration, and the quiet, creeping fear that they were no longer in control. Margaret Fenton, ever the numbers-driven bureaucrat, was the first to recover, her fingers tightening around her clipboard as if holding on to it might somehow reassert her position in this unraveling hierarchy. She looked at Randy, waiting for him to do what he always did, issue some final, definitive ruling, some condescending decree that would put everything back in its proper order. But Randy wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone. His gaze was fixed on me, and for the first time since this all began, he looked unsure. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, watched the flicker of defiance war with the bitter realization that he was standing on ground that was no longer his. But before he could speak, before he could scrape together whatever pride he had left and try to reassert his dominance, a new voice cut through the tension. I just got off the phone with the city's water department. The voice belonged to Stephanie Caldwell, the same woman who had always been the HOA's biggest defender, the one who had attended every meeting, nodded along to every rule change, and self-righteously reminded others that community guidelines exist for a reason. But now, standing near the curb with her phone still clutched in her hand, her face was pale, her voice strained, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at me like I was the problem. She was looking at the HOA. "They said there's been no official work orders for Maple Crest in over a year," she continued, her voice sharper now, cutting through the stunned murmurs of the neighbors who had started gathering around her. "They have no record of the HOA maintaining any part of the water system. No scheduled checks, no emergency reports, nothing." She turned her gaze to Randy, then to Margaret, her expression hardening with something dangerously close to betrayal. "So if there's no contractor handling this, and the city hasn't been involved, then what the hell have we been paying for?" A ripple of unease spread through the growing crowd, a murmur of realization settling over them like a slow-moving wave. The HOA had always operated under the assumption that their word was law, that people would follow their rules without question, would pay their dues without looking too closely at where the money was going. But now people were looking, and they were starting to see the cracks. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Derek, usually so eager to parrot Randy's authority, was staring down at his shoes like a guilty child caught in a lie. And Randy, who had spent years posturing as the untouchable ruler of Maple Crest Estates, Looked like a man trying to find solid ground in a world that was crumbling beneath him. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment stretch, letting them feel it. Then finally, I turned my gaze back to Randy, my voice quiet even. Seems like you've got a lot of explaining to do. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time, the HOA wasn't just losing control. They had already lost it. Randy's face darkened as the weight of Stephanie's words settled over the crowd. The murmurs of unease had sharpened into something more dangerous, something that even he couldn't ignore. People were no longer just grumbling about broken sprinklers or flooded yards. They were questioning the very foundation of the HOA's authority. For years, Randy had ruled through bureaucracy, using fines and regulations like weapons, leveraging control over the smallest details of people's lives to keep them in line. But now, those same people were beginning to realize that the HOA wasn't the well-oiled machine it had pretended to be. It was a facade, and the moment they stopped believing in it, it would crumble. Randy squared his shoulders, inhaling deeply, forcing himself back into the performance of control. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice louder now, sharp and commanding. "We have a system in place and we're handling the situation. If you all would just remain calm and let the board do its job." "Your job?" Tony Alvarez cut in, his voice edged with quiet fury as he stepped forward. He had been standing on the sidelines until now, watching, waiting, but something had shifted in him. "What exactly is your job, Randy? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been collecting dues for services you're not even providing." The crowd murmured in agreement, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty in Randy's eyes. He opened his mouth, but Tony wasn't done. "I've been paying HOA fees for 10 years, he continued, his voice growing stronger. "You've fined people for leaving their trash cans out a few minutes too long, but you can't even tell us who's in charge of our water? You act like you're running a damn empire, but you don't even know what's going on behind the scenes. You don't know anything." Randy's face reddened. "That's not true." Stephanie scoffed, folding her arms. "Then prove it. Explain how our water system actually works. Go ahead, tell us what you've been doing to maintain it. Because I just spoke to the city, and they don't have any records of the HOA actually managing anything. So where's the money going, Randy?" A deeper, heavier silence settled over the crowd. This was no longer about irrigation problems. This was about something bigger. This was about trust. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her grip tightening on her clipboard, but she said nothing. Derek, always the follower, looked trapped, his eyes darting between Randy and the residents, as if trying to figure out which side would be safer to stand on. And Randy looked like a man standing on the edge of a collapsing bridge, trying to convince himself that the ground beneath him was still solid. "I don't owe you all an explanation," he finally said, his voice strained, his authority cracking like old paint. "The HOA is responsible for managing this community, and you agreed to abide by the rules when you moved in. That hasn't changed." "But it has," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped forward, my gaze locking onto his. "It changed the moment people realized you don't actually know what you're doing." His jaw clenched. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" I tilted my head slightly. "I think I'm the only reason this community's water system hasn't completely collapsed already. And I think you made a very stupid mistake when you decided to turn me into your enemy." For the first time since this all began, Randy had no response. And just like that, the final thread holding his authority together began to unravel. The moment stretched between us, thick with unspoken truths and the mounting weight of realization. Randy stood rigid, his forced authority cracking under the weight of too many unanswered questions, too many suspicious glances from the very people who had once obeyed him without question. The crowd had grown larger, shifting closer, no longer content to stand passively on the sidelines. The whispers of frustration had transformed into something else entirely. Doubt. And doubt, once it took root, spread like wildfire. I watched the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, his mind scrambling for a way to wrestle back control. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not out in the open with his authority hanging by a thread. But his worst mistake had always been assuming that people would never stop believing in the power he pretended to have. "I've had enough of this," he said finally, his voice sharp and forced, a last-ditch effort to regain the illusion of control. "We will handle the water issue internally. If you have complaints, file them properly. This is still my—" But before he could finish, Tony Alvarez's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're what, Randy?" Tony's expression was cold now, the easygoing neighborly politeness completely stripped away. He took a slow step forward, forcing Randy to acknowledge him, forcing him to stand in the judgment of the very people he had spent years ruling over. "Your neighborhood? Your personal little kingdom?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Because I don't think that's how this works anymore." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. Stephanie Caldwell crossed her arms, nodding along. Even some of the homeowners who had always been Randy's quiet supporters were shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between him and the others. The unspoken contract that had allowed the HOA to rule unchecked was being rewritten right before his eyes. Randy's nostrils flared, his shoulders stiff. "You all signed agreements when you moved in," he said, louder now, his words desperate, brittle. "You agreed to the rules. You agreed to be scammed?" Stephanie's voice was sharp, cutting through his sentence. She turned, gesturing toward the growing group of residents. "Because that's what this is, isn't it? We pay for services that don't exist. We follow rules that only benefit the board. And the second we start asking questions, you expect us to shut up and accept whatever garbage excuse you feed us?" She looked around now, her voice rising, inviting others to join her. "How much have we all been paying for a water system that's been running on borrowed time? How much of our money has just disappeared into HOA nonsense while the actual infrastructure falls apart?" The murmurs of the crowd were louder now, sharper. The shift was happening. The moment where passive frustration turned into action, where the power Randy had always taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. Margaret stepped forward, her expression tight, panicked. "This isn't the time for—" "Oh, it's exactly the time," I said, my voice quiet but firm, cutting through the noise like steel. "Because here's the thing." I turned to face the residents now, making sure every word landed. "This neighborhood? It's held together by more than just HOA rules and fines. It's held together by actual maintenance, by systems that need to be monitored, adjusted, and understood. And the people running the show?" I turned back to Randy now, holding his gaze. "They have no idea how any of it actually works." Margaret opened her mouth, but I didn't let her interrupt. "They had a contractor handling the system, but they lost that contract over a year ago. They've been taking your money, your dues, while assuming someone else was keeping everything running, but no one was." I let the words hang there for a beat, then added, "Well, no one except me." The realization rippled through the crowd. I could see the exact moment it sank in. I had let this community function. I had kept their water flowing, their pressure balanced, their entire system from completely breaking down, and the HOA had been too incompetent to even realize it. Someone in the crowd spoke first. "He's right." A man near the back, someone I didn't know well, shook his head. "Hell, I had a leak last year and the HOA never did anything. But Ethan, he helped me reroute my line." Another voice. "I asked them about a pressure issue 3 months ago and they told me to submit a form. Nothing ever happened." And then, the final, decisive blow. Stephanie stepped forward. "We should vote." The entire crowd stilled, waiting. Stephanie took a breath, squared her shoulders. "We should vote to remove them, right here, right now." Randy's face drained of color. Margaret's clipboard slipped from her fingers, hitting the pavement with a hollow clap. Derek looked like he wanted to run. I said nothing. I didn't have to, because I had already won. A slow hush fell over the gathering, the kind that carried a weight far heavier than silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the collective, unspoken shift in power. The moment when an empire realizes its walls have crumbled, when a ruler understands he is no longer standing on a throne, but on the edge of an abyss. Randy Colton, who had spent years wielding authority over this neighborhood with absolute control, stood at the center of it, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, his eyes darting across the sea of faces that no longer belonged to obedient residents, but to something much more dangerous, people who had stopped being afraid. For years, fear had been his greatest weapon, the quiet, persistent kind that kept people in line, not because they respected him, but because they had convinced themselves it wasn't worth the trouble to push back. Fines for minor infractions, threats of legal action, selective enforcement of rules designed to keep the board at the top of the food chain. These were the tools that had built his kingdom. But now, standing before a crowd that no longer saw him as an untouchable figure of authority, but rather as a con man exposed under unforgiving light, I could see the moment he understood that his weapons no longer worked. Stephanie's words still hung in the air. We should vote, lingering like an echo that could not be erased. No one argued, no one hesitated. Instead, there was only a shift, a collective leaning in, a quiet anticipation, the weight of a long-buried revolution finally pressing against the surface. Randy was losing control, and he knew it. Margaret was the first to break. Her normally rigid posture, always prim and calculated, had collapsed into something almost pitiful. She bent down, fumbling for her clipboard with shaking fingers, as though if she could just retrieve it, just wrap her hands around the familiar weight of it, everything would snap back into place. Derek, on the other hand, had already taken a step back, his body angled slightly away, as if his instincts were screaming at him to abandon the sinking ship before it dragged him down with it. Cowards always recognize the moment when it's time to flee. But Randy was still fighting it. His lips parted, but no words came, not at first, because what could he possibly say to reverse this? What argument could he make that would somehow erase the last 20 minutes of absolute exposure? He was struggling, grasping for anything, any loose thread of control, any hint of authority left to wield. And then, in one final, desperate move, he did what all cornered men do. He doubled down. This is ridiculous. His voice was sharp, commanding, though it carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. You can't just throw out an HOA board because of a plumbing issue. This is a community, a structured organization. You agreed to this when you moved here. There are rules. His gaze snapped to Stephanie, to Tony, to me, each word sharper than the last, slicing through the tension with the last remnants of his authority. If you remove us, who the hell is going to run things? You. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, but there was no real amusement behind it. It was hollow, desperate. Who's going to enforce regulations? Who's going to make sure this neighborhood doesn't fall apart? You think you can do better? Tony took a step forward, slow and deliberate, his presence solid, grounded, utterly unshaken. Yeah, he said simply, his voice calm in a way that only made Randy look more frantic. I do. It was such a small statement, so simple, yet it carried a weight that shattered the last fragile illusion Randy had been clinging to. This wasn't a temporary revolt. This wasn't a moment of outrage that would fade, leaving things to return to normal. This was the end. People in the crowd started nodding, some muttering in agreement, others simply standing taller, bolder. The fear was gone now, evaporated like mist beneath the rising sun. And in its place, resolution. Stephanie turned then, facing the crowd, her voice clear, steady. All in favor of a vote to recall the HOA board. A single hand went up, then another, and then it was everyone. Randy exhaled sharply, his composure slipping entirely, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Margaret looked ready to cry. Derek, useless, silent Derek, was already taking another slow step backward, his eyes flicking toward his car like he was contemplating making a run for it. But there was nowhere left to run. I stayed where I was, watching it unfold, the slow, methodical unraveling of a system that had stood unchallenged for years. I had done my part. I had set the pieces in motion, created the first crack in the dam, and now I didn't even have to push, because the weight of their own arrogance was pulling them under. Randy opened his mouth, one last attempt, one final desperate bid for control. But before he could even speak, Stephanie turned back to face him. It's over. 2 words. Simple. Absolute. And this time, Randy had no response. The words "it's over" lingered in the air, final and unshakable, carrying a weight that even Randy couldn't ignore. He stood motionless, his jaw locked so tight I could see the muscle twitch in his temple, his fingers curled into fists at his sides, as if sheer force of will could stop the ground from crumbling beneath him. But it was already gone. Around us, the neighborhood stood still, a living, breathing entity that had woken up from years of passive obedience. The people who had once grumbled behind closed doors, who had reluctantly paid fines and followed rules they never agreed with, now stood unified, their expressions sharp with the realization that they didn't have to be afraid anymore. Their hands were raised not in suggestion, not in hesitant rebellion, but in absolute decision. And Randy, for all his blustering, for all the years he had spent wielding power over them like a weapon, was nothing against that. Margaret looked completely drained, her usual rigid posture wilted, her hands gripping her clipboard with white-knuckled intensity as though the paperwork inside could somehow save her from the inevitable. Derek had already begun his retreat, shifting further toward the back of the group, trying to distance himself from the sinking ship. But Randy wasn't going to let go without a fight. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice thick with disbelief, his eyes darting over the crowd as if searching for someone, anyone who might still be on his side. But there was no one left. Even the handful of residents who had always been staunch defenders of the HOA weren't looking at him the way they used to. They weren't looking at him as a leader anymore. They were looking at him as a man unraveling. "You can't just throw out an HOA board in the middle of the street," he snapped, a last-ditch attempt at control, at finding some legal foothold that could stop what was happening. "That's not how it works. You want to replace me? Fine. File the paperwork. Submit a proposal. But this—" He gestured wildly at the raised hands, the determined expressions, the undeniable force of the people standing against him. "This isn't a real vote." Stephanie met his stare without flinching. "It is if the community says it is," she said simply, her voice calm, resolute. "This isn't your neighborhood anymore, Randy. It belongs to all of us." And just like that, his last shield shattered. I watched the moment it happened, the exact second he realized that no amount of posturing or legal threats could put the pieces back together. It wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't about rules. It was about something much simpler. He had lost their respect, and he was never getting it back. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, his breath heavy, uneven. His hands twitched at his sides, as if resisting the urge to lash out, to do something, anything, to regain control. But what was left for him to do? Nothing, because he had already been erased. The seconds stretched, the silence suffocating, until finally he turned away. Without another word, without another plea, without the dignity of even acknowledging his downfall, Randy Colton stepped back, his shoulders tight, his expression locked in furious defeat. He walked toward his car stiffly, climbing in with the mechanical movements of a man who no longer knew what to do with himself. The door slammed shut. The tires screeched against the pavement as he sped away. Just like that, he was gone. A ripple of something almost surreal passed through the crowd, a quiet murmur, a slow realization that they had done it. The HOA board was no longer in control. The people who had lorded over this community for years, who had treated it as their own private domain, had been dethroned in the span of a single afternoon. Stephanie let out a slow breath and turned to me, the tension in her shoulders finally releasing. "Well," she said, a little dazed but determined. "Now what?" I allowed myself a small, knowing smile. "Now," I said, "we rebuild." The dust hadn't even settled, but the weight in the air had changed. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't standing in the shadow of the HOA's rule. It was standing on its own. There was no Randy barking orders, no Margaret flipping through paperwork looking for a way to find someone, no Derek skulking behind them like a loyal lapdog. There was only a quiet, tentative sense of freedom, as though people were waiting to see if this was really happening, if the world they had known for so long had actually changed. I watched as the crowd slowly unraveled into small clusters of conversation. Some people looked dazed, still processing what had just happened. Others, like Tony Alvarez, looked ready to celebrate, the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years finally breaking free in a shake of his head and a low, amused chuckle. "Damn," he muttered, glancing at me. "I never thought I'd see the day." I gave him a sideways look, the smallest smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Took longer than it should have," I admitted, scanning the faces of my neighbors, watching them step into the first breaths of a world without an HOA board looming over them. It was strange, seeing them like this, lighter, relieved, like prisoners walking into open air for the first time in years. "Stephanie," ever the one to take charge when a vacuum of power presented itself, stepped toward the center of the group, clearing her throat. "All right," she said, rubbing her hands together, her voice regaining its usual strength. "We just tore down the old system. Now we have to figure out what comes next." The murmurs started again, but this time there was no fear in them, just possibility. It was strange how fast things could change. Just this morning, people had woken up in a neighborhood that functioned under rigid control, where everything was dictated by an authority that couldn't be questioned. Now they were looking at each other like equals. I didn't say much as they talked, as Stephanie and a few others started discussing the next steps. Some wanted to form a more resident-led association, one that actually worked for the people instead of against them. Others suggested scrapping the system altogether, letting the neighborhood run itself. Ideas bounced back and forth, and for the first time, real decisions were being made by the people who actually lived here, not by a handful of power-hungry board members sitting in an office, pretending they knew what was best. After a while, I felt a hand clap my shoulder, and I turned to see Tony grinning. "So," he said, tilting his head, "you gonna take some credit for all this?" I let out a small breath, shaking my head. "Nah," I said. "This was bound to happen one way or another." His grin widened. "Yeah, maybe. But you sure as hell sped it up." I didn't argue. I had done what I set out to do. I had watched as the HOA tried to cut me down, as they turned me into an enemy, and I had let them think they were in control, right up until the moment they realized they never really had any control at all. I had spent years keeping this community running silently in the background, fixing the mistakes they didn't even know they were making. And when they had decided they didn't need me anymore, when they had tried to strip me of something they had no right to take, I had made sure they understood just how wrong they were. Now, as I looked around at the neighborhood, at the people standing taller, freer, I realized this was better than any revenge I could have planned. The HOA was gone. The people had taken their power back, and Maple Crest Estates had finally become what it should have been all along. A few days passed, but the echoes of that afternoon still lingered in the neighborhood, an invisible shift in the air that everyone could feel, but no one could quite put into words. There was no grand announcement, no official declaration, just the undeniable reality that the HOA was gone, and with it, the suffocating control that had ruled Maple Crest Estates for years. The first few mornings afterward felt almost surreal, the absence of their presence more noticeable than their rule had ever been. No passive-aggressive emails dictating lawn heights, no violation notices tucked onto doors like quiet threats, no Margaret pacing up and down the sidewalks with her clipboard, looking for some petty infraction to enforce. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. I had expected chaos, had thought maybe there would be some backlash, some attempt by Randy or Margaret or one of their remaining loyalists to claw back some level of control. But none came. Randy was gone. No one had seen him since the vote, his house sitting quiet, his car missing from the driveway. Margaret had retreated, no longer patrolling the streets like a self-appointed enforcer, and Derek had done what Derek always did, followed someone else's lead. This time, that lead was walking straight out the door. I stood on my porch early one morning, coffee in hand, watching as the first real signs of change took root. Tony was already outside, working on his flower beds, a small radio playing somewhere in the background. A few doors down, Stephanie stood with a small group of neighbors, gesturing as they talked over the new, resident-led community plan they had begun drafting. The tension that had defined this place for so long, the underlying sense that everyone was walking on eggshells under the HOA's rule, was gone. It felt good. Damn good. I hadn't done it for recognition. Hell, I hadn't even done it out of some grand sense of justice. I had done it because I had built something they had tried to take from me without ever realizing just how much they depended on it. And when they had pushed, I had pushed back. Now, standing here, seeing the neighborhood reclaim itself, I knew I had won. Not just against Randy, not just against the board, but against the entire system they had built to control people. A soft voice pulled me from my thoughts. "So," Linda, my wife, said as she stepped onto the porch beside me, a second coffee cup in hand, She passed it to me, watching my face carefully. How does it feel? I took a slow sip, the warmth settling in my chest as I looked back out at the street, at the place that, for the first time in years, actually felt like home. There was no HOA anymore, no more bureaucratic nonsense, no more petty power struggles disguised as community improvement, just people, living. I exhaled, letting the weight of it all finally sink in. It feels like I turned the sprinklers back on, I said with a smirk, taking another sip. Linda chuckled, shaking her head. You're impossible. I grinned, wrapping an arm around her waist as I leaned against the porch railing and watching as the first sprinkler system in weeks hissed to life in a neighbor's yard. Water, long denied, flowing freely once again, balance restored, power reclaimed, and this time no one could take it away. The days stretched into weeks, and the changes settled in as if things had always been this way. No HOA, no ridiculous rules, no one looming over the neighborhood, waiting to pounce on the smallest infraction. Life went on, but for the first time, it felt like it belonged to the people who lived here. Yards were still maintained, not because of some fine, but because people took pride in their homes. Neighbors worked together, not out of obligation, but out of actual community. The streets felt open, free, real. The strangest part wasn't how quickly people adjusted to this new way of life. It was how they thrived. A few of the residents, Tony, Stephanie, and some others, formed a new neighborhood committee, one built on transparency and collaboration instead of arbitrary control. No one had absolute power anymore. No one could hold the community hostage with paperwork and fines. Decisions were made together, through open discussion, not behind closed doors. It was everything the HOA had claimed to be, but never was. As for me, I stayed out of it. I had never wanted a seat at the table. I had just wanted them to realize they didn't own the table in the first place. I kept the water system running, same as before, only now people knew. They understood what it took to keep things functioning. They understood the value of the things they had once taken for granted. And best of all, they understood that power belonged to the people who lived here, not to the ones who tried to control them. One afternoon, as I was adjusting a pressure valve near the main irrigation system, Tony walked over, hands in his pockets, watching me work for a moment before shaking his head with a smirk. You really did it, man. You took them down without ever lifting a finger. I let out a slow breath, tightening the last bolt before standing. No, I said, stretching my shoulders, feeling the ease of a neighborhood that no longer carried the weight of unnecessary control. I just turned the pressure up. Change happens when people stop accepting the way things are and start questioning who actually holds the power. Whether it's a neighborhood, a workplace, or an entire system, the truth is always the same. Power only exists where people allow it to exist. And the moment they stop believing in it, the moment they push back, everything shifts. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life battles against the absurdity of broken systems. And remember, sometimes all it takes to bring down an empire is knowing exactly where to turn the pressure up.